I still remember the moment everything inside me cracked. It was the night my own daughter looked me in the eye, held the dress I had poured my soul into, and dismissed it as something only a cheap woman would wear. The room fell silent, but inside me, something shattered loud enough to echo for years. Humiliation burned through my chest, mixing with a grief I had no words for. I walked away that night carrying a wound so deep it felt permanent. But wounds have a strange way of teaching us who we really are and what we refuse to become. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you have not already, do not forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you will not want to miss. Let us begin. I woke before sunrise, the way I always had, long before the rest of Savannah stirred. The quiet of my little house in the historic district wrapped around me like a familiar quilt, soft but frayed at the edges from years of use. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and let my feet rest on the cool wooden floor. The boards creaked in recognition. Some mornings it almost felt as if the house whispered back to me, carrying memories in its bones that only someone my age would bother listening to. When I opened my bedroom door, the faint scent of Spanish moss drifted through the cracked window. The trees outside leaned over the street like old women sharing secrets, their long branches swaying slightly as the early light painted silver streaks along the walls. The neighborhood was quiet except for a few distant gulls and the low hum of a river breeze rolling in from the Savannah River. I loved that sound. It reminded me of Marcus and the years he worked at the shipyard, coming home with the salty smell of metal and water clinging to his shirt. He used to say the river talked to him. Some days I believed it. I walked to the back room, my sewing studio, and switched on the lamp. The warm glow fell over my machine, a sturdy old Singer that had outlived 3 presidents, several hurricanes, and most of the people who once brought me their Sunday best to mend. Spools of thread lined the shelves in neat rows, though I never remembered arranging them. My hands often did things out of habit before my mind caught up. A box of fabric scraps sat under the work table, stuffed with pieces that held little fragments of other people's stories. On the corner of the table was the wooden box where I kept the last traces of Marcus. Inside lay a folded photograph, a few buttons he had once picked up from a flea market, and a strip of deep red fabric that had softened with time. When I touched it, something inside my chest softened too, the way it always did. Marcus had been gone for many years, yet the memory of him still drifted through the house like dust in sunlight, impossible to catch, but always there. I made myself a cup of coffee and stepped outside onto the small porch. Maya Alvarez, my closest friend and the owner of the coffee shop at the end of the block, was unlocking her door across the street. She waved. I lifted my mug in return. No words needed. We had known each other long enough to understand whole conversations through gestures alone. Savannah moved slowly in the mornings, which suited me fine. By the time I returned inside, the sun was climbing just high enough to warm the curtains. I moved toward the studio with a sense of anticipation. Today, I would begin something important, something precious, something I had dreamed of doing for decades. On the table lay a roll of ivory fabric I had purchased weeks earlier. Next to it, I placed Marcus's red scrap gently, like a blessing. My daughter Heather was getting married soon, and I intended to sew her wedding dress myself. Despite the distance between us, despite the awkward phone calls and the careful politeness in her voice, I wanted to believe this dress could bridge the space that had grown between mother and daughter. As I threaded the needle, a thought brushed my mind quietly but firmly, almost like a whisper from the past. Maybe this time she will see me. And with that hope steadying my hands, I began to sew. If you are still watching and feeling the weight of this unfolding story, please comment number 1 below to let me know you are with me. Now let us move on to chapter 2. I laid the ivory fabric across my work table with the kind of reverence other people reserve for prayer books. The cloth felt soft under my fingertips, almost warm, as if it held the memory of every stitch I had ever sewn in my life. I set Marcus's red fabric scrap beside it, letting the deep color remind me of the steadiness he once represented. The combination of those two pieces, one pale and one bold, felt like a quiet conversation between past and future. I wanted Heather to feel that connection, even if she never understood it fully. One by one, I prepared the tiny handwritten notes that I planned to sew into the lining. My handwriting had grown shakier with age, but I wrote slowly, refusing to let the tremble of my fingers distort the meaning. Each note carried something I had never said aloud. There were memories of her childhood, moments like the first time she twirled in one of the dresses I had sewn, and small hopes for her marriage. I folded every piece of paper carefully, then slipped them between the fabric layers. I stitched around them so delicately that no one could have guessed the messages hidden inside. It felt like tucking pieces of my heart into a place where she could carry them, even if she never knew they existed. The days passed in quiet rhythm. At night, the house was still except for the hum of my machine and the distant cry of a train drifting across the river. My eyes burned after hours of concentration, but I kept going, telling myself that mothers had a different kind of endurance. I believed that if Heather wore this dress, even for a moment, she might feel the love threaded through it. When I finished most of the bodice, I snapped a picture with my old phone and sent it to her. Her reply came minutes later. It simply read, "Okay." I tried not to let the bluntness sting. I told myself she was busy. I told myself 100 things that made disappointment easier to hold. A week later, I traveled across the town to the place she was staying while preparing for the wedding. The house was large, sleek, and filled with the sterile shine of modern design. I felt out of place the moment I walked in, the kind of out of place that sits heavy in the stomach and makes the air feel too thin. Heather and her friends were gathered around a marble kitchen island, laughing over brunch and mimosas. Their clothes crisp, their voices loud, their eyes sparkling with the sort of confidence that came from being part of a world I had never belonged to. I stepped toward them with the dress held carefully in a white cloth bag. Before I could say anything, Heather unwrapped it and gave it a single dismissive glance. Her lips tightened. The room quieted. Then she said the words that cut through me with a sharpness no needle ever could. "It looks like a dress for cheap women." One of the women beside her laughed under her breath. The sound echoed inside me like a crack in old wood. Heather lifted the dress and dropped it straight into the kitchen trash can. I felt the world tilt a little, as if the floor had loosened beneath my feet. I said nothing. I could not. Silence was the only shield I had left. I turned and walked out before my tears betrayed me. Outside, the Georgia sun pressed hot against my skin, but I felt cold. Later, when I returned to quietly retrieve the dress, I noticed a slip of paper peeking from the folded lining, jarred loose. A sign that something deeper waited beneath the surface of all this hurt. I held the ruined dress close as I left, sensing that this moment was not an ending, but the beginning of a storm I could no longer avoid. If you are still watching and the tension is starting to pull you in, please comment number 2 below so I know you are following closely. Now, let us move on to chapter 3. By the time I reached my house, the sun had already slipped behind the oaks, leaving the street washed in a dull purple haze. The air felt heavier than usual, as if Savannah itself sensed the weight I carried, I shut the door behind me, and for a moment I simply stood there, listening to the quiet pulse of the old house. My hands were trembling. My throat felt tight, as though every breath had to fight its way out. I had walked home in a daze, but inside these familiar walls, the truth of what had happened settled on me with a crushing clarity. I carried the dress into the sewing room and placed it gently on the table. The lamp cast a soft circle of yellow light over the fabric. Even from a distance, I could see the creases created by careless hands. The skirt had lost its shape, the bodice had been twisted, and bits of debris clung to the delicate ivory surface. When I lifted it, something slipped free and fluttered to the floor. I bent slowly, knees stiff, and picked up one of the hidden notes I had stitched into the lining. Seeing it there, jarred, loose, and exposed, felt like a cruel metaphor for the way my love had been treated. For a long while I sat in silence, the crumpled note resting in my palm. Memories rose uninvited. Heather at 5 years old, with curls bouncing as she raced across the backyard. Heather at 10, begging me to sew a blue dress she had seen in a catalog. Heather at 14, rolling her eyes but still sprawling across my lap when the world hurt her feelings. Those moments drifted through me like warm shadows, and each one deepened the sting of what she had become. Somewhere along the way, I had lost her, or maybe she had chosen to lose me. The sewing room grew darker as the evening settled in. The single lamp struggled against the shadows, elongating my silhouette across the wall. I felt suspended between the woman I had been and the woman life was shaping me into. The quiet pressed against my chest until I heard my own voice break it, no louder than breath. Enough. The word startled me. It felt unfamiliar, like a stranger had spoken it through my lips, yet it carried truth. I rose and faced the mirror that hung beside the fabric shelves. A tired woman with silver hair and red-rimmed eyes stared back. But beneath that exhaustion I saw something else. A glimmer. A hard, clear line of resolve that had not been there earlier. I realized then that my silence, the same silence I had once believed was kindness, had turned into permission. Permission for others to diminish me. Permission for my own daughter to forget who I was. I turned back to the dress. Its wrinkles no longer looked like damage. They looked like challenge. Slowly, with steady hands, I began to undo the lining. Each tug of the thread felt like releasing a knot that had lived inside me for years. Beneath the fabric, the remaining folded notes sat intact, waiting. I smoothed the surface with my palm. This dress no longer belonged to Heather. It belonged to me, not as a keepsake, but as a declaration. I pulled my chair forward and switched on the second lamp. Light flooded the table. The needle pierced the cloth with a rhythmic certainty, each stitch a quiet vow. I sewed without hurry, yet without pause, letting the work carry me into a space beyond anger and sadness. As night deepened, the world outside faded to stillness, but I kept sewing. I knew, without fully understanding how, that I was stitching something far greater than a wedding gown. I was stitching myself back together. If you are still watching and sensing that the cracks are only beginning to show, please comment number 3 below to let me know you are still here. Now, let us continue with Chapter 4. Morning light slipped through the curtains in thin, weary lines, settling across the sewing room like a reminder of how long I had been awake. My eyes burned from the night before, and my shoulders ached from bending over the machine for hours, yet I felt strangely alert, as though exhaustion had sharpened rather than dulled me. The dress sat on the mannequin near the window, its fabric catching the soft glow of dawn. I had repaired most of the damage, smoothing out wrinkles and reinforcing the seams, but the hurt underneath those stitches still pulsed through me. Even so, a fragile thread of hope tugged at my heart. Maybe things had not reached their final breaking point. Maybe there was still a way to reach Heather before the distance between us turned into something permanent. The memory of her as a little girl, tugging at my sleeve, asking me to sew her something new, still lived inside me, and I clung to it with stubborn tenderness. If I could just talk to her quietly, without the noise of her friends or the rushed pace of her new life, perhaps she would hear me. I picked up the phone and dialed her number before I could talk myself out of it. The rings felt long, stretched thin with dread. When she finally answered, her voice sounded clipped, rushed, as if she had already decided she did not have time for whatever I might say. I told her I wanted to meet. She replied that she was busy preparing for the bridal events. That was all. No room for discussion. The call ended with a hollow click, leaving my hand trembling slightly around the phone. Still, I tried again. I sent her a message longer than I usually allowed myself to send. I explained that I had finished repairing the gown and that I hoped she might look at it again. Her reply came quickly, a short line that gave nothing back. The words felt cold, like rain falling through open fingers. Each response widened the space between us, and despite my efforts, I felt myself drifting toward a familiar ache, one that echoed too closely the emptiness I felt after losing Marcus. Yet I held the dress, lifted the fabric, and told myself I had to try one last time. I folded it gently and traveled back to the neighborhood where she was staying. The houses there seemed to gleam in the sunlight, polished and identical, their driveways holding cars that looked as if they had never known a scratch. When I knocked on the door, my heart pounded with a desperate rhythm. A young woman opened it, someone I had seen briefly at Heather's gathering. She looked at me with polite confusion. I asked to speak with Heather. The woman shook her head and said she was not available. The words were delivered with a practiced sweetness, but the meaning was sharp. When I offered the dress, she refused to take it. The door closed before I could say anything else. I stood there for a moment, staring at the smooth paint of the door. The rejection settled over me like a heavy shawl I had no strength to remove. I turned and walked back toward the bus stop, passing manicured lawns and trimmed hedges that felt surreal in their perfection. When I returned home, the familiar sights of my neighborhood wrapped around me like a sigh. Maya waved from her shop, but I could only lift my hand weakly in return. Inside my house, I set the dress back on the mannequin. The late afternoon sun lit it from behind, casting a soft glow along the seams I had worked so hard to repair. I realized then that every gentle attempt I had made had led me to the same wall. Heather would not hear me, and perhaps she was not meant to. As the light faded, I understood something with a clarity that steadied me. If she would not listen to my voice, then she would hear my silence. If you are still watching and the story is gripping you deeper than before, please comment number 4 below so I know you are with me. Now, let us turn the page to chapter 5. The evening air in Charleston carried a faint chill as I stepped out of the car and stared up at the grand hotel where the rehearsal dinner was being held. Lights glimmered from the tall windows, spilling onto the pavement like liquid gold. It felt like walking toward a world built for someone else, a world polished and glittering, where voices floated lightly and nothing weighed on the heart. I held the white fabric bag close to my chest, feeling the stiff curve of the hanger inside and the quiet strength of the gown I had rebuilt stitch by stitch. It was strange to think that the same dress had once sat crushed at the bottom of a trash can. Now it shone with a beauty that surprised even me. Inside the ballroom, the chandeliers glowed with a soft amber light, illuminating clusters of guests dressed in expensive fabrics. Laughter rose and swirled around the room like perfume. The place smelled of roses, candle wax, and a hint of white wine. As I stepped in, conversation slowed. A few people glanced my way, eyes flicking from my simple cream dress to the bag in my arms. Their expressions said enough. I did not belong here. Across the room, Heather stood beside her future mother-in-law, radiant in a silver cocktail dress. She laughed easily, her posture poised with a confidence that seemed entirely foreign to the child I once knew. When she finally turned and spotted me, the smile slid from her face. The change was sharp, immediate, unmistakable. She took a step forward, hesitation tightening her features, as though my presence threatened to unravel the appearance she had so carefully crafted for this evening. No one approached me. No one greeted me. I could feel the guests deciding silently who I must be. Perhaps a vendor, perhaps a staff member who had wandered into the wrong room, perhaps simply someone without enough shine to be worth a glance. But I had not come to fit into this world. I had come to reclaim my own. When the lights dimmed slightly in preparation for a round of toasts, a stillness settled over the room. It was that stillness that gave me the courage to move. I stepped forward, my shoes tapping gently against the polished floor. Heads turned, one row at a time, like a wave of curiosity rolling across the ballroom. Heather's eyes widened in panic. She reached out as if to stop me, but I walked past her with a calm I did not fully understand. I reached the center of the room and loosened the drawstring of the white bag. The fabric parted, and the gown emerged under the warm lights, glittering with every stitch of restoration. Gasps rose around me. The crystals on the skirt caught the chandelier light and scattered it in delicate flecks across the room. It looked like something pulled from a dream, yet every inch of it had been born from nights of loneliness and love. I lifted the gown so it was visible to everyone. The weight of the room pressed in, but my voice rose steadily as I spoke. I kept my words simple, plain, honest. I described the nights I spent sewing, the years of sacrifice that had shaped the hands holding the dress, and the moment Heather had thrown it away as if it meant nothing. The air tightened around us. Some guests lowered their eyes. Others stared at Heather with disbelief. She stood frozen, her face pale, her lips trembling. Tears slid down her cheeks, but they came too late. I held the dress a little closer and finished with a truth I needed to say for myself more than for anyone else. This dress may have been trash to you, but it was my love, and I will not let my love be thrown away again. Then I turned, the gown pressed against my heart, and walked out through the heavy doors as the room erupted in whispers behind me. The night air outside the Charleston Hotel felt strangely cool against my skin as I stepped through the heavy glass doors. Behind me, the ballroom still pulsed with muffled voices and uneasy whispers, but the world beyond the entrance was calm and washed in moonlight. I walked a few steps onto the wide stone terrace and stopped, holding the restored wedding gown in my arms as if it were something alive, something breathing with the weight of everything I had endured. The doors closed behind me with a soft thud that felt final, almost ceremonial, like the last page of a chapter turning by itself. I stood very still and listened to the hum of traffic along the riverfront. The water in the distance moved with a slow rhythm, and the wind carried its cool breath across the terrace. For the first time in years, I felt the sound of my own heart more clearly than the noise of others. It beat fast, but with a steadiness that surprised me. I had spoken the truth in front of everyone, and instead of feeling regret or fear, I felt a quiet strength rising in my chest. The ballroom light spilled faintly through the glass behind me, reflecting in the crystals on the dress. I looked down at the gown and thought of the nights I spent sewing, the anger I had swallowed for years, and the daughter who had forgotten the hands that raised her. A part of me wondered whether I had been too harsh, whether I should go back inside and soften the wound I had just opened. Another part, deeper and older, whispered that this was the first time I had defended myself without apology. The door swung open again. Heather appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled, her makeup smudged, her chest rising and falling with fast breaths. She looked smaller than she had inside the ballroom, almost fragile against the bright lights behind her. For a moment, she simply stared at me. Then her voice broke in a way I had not heard since she was a child. "Mom!" The word shook as if it carried the weight of all her pride cracking at once. She stepped toward me, her heels clicking unevenly across the stone. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak again, but the words dissolved before they formed. Finally, she managed a whisper. "I am sorry. Please." Her voice was soft, raw, and frightened, but I could hear the confusion underneath it. Was she sorry for what she had done to me, or was she terrified of losing her image in front of her new family? I looked at her carefully, searching her face the way a seamstress searches fabric for hidden tears. I saw shame, fear, and a pain that mirrored my own. But I also saw the years of disregard, the careless comments, the growing distance she had chosen long before this night. My heart ached for her, but it also ached for myself, for the woman who had spent decades believing that love meant silence. A long pause stretched between us. For the first time, I understood that I had a choice too. I could step forward, comfort her, and fall into the same old pattern of forgiveness without change. Or I could hold my ground and wait for her to learn what love costs. I lifted my chin slightly. My voice was steady when I finally spoke. "Not yet," I said. "You need to understand what love costs." Heather sank onto the bench near the entrance, her shoulders shaking. Tears streamed freely down her cheeks, no longer driven by embarrassment, but by fear of losing the relationship she had taken for granted. I turned away from her, the gown held firmly against my chest. As I descended the steps into the soft glow of the streetlights, I felt both the ache and the freedom of the moment. The dress shimmered under the warm gold light, and I realized I was carrying not only fabric, but my own reclaimed dignity. This was not an ending. This was the beginning of the truth. If you are still watching and the turning point has you on edge, please comment number 6 below to let me know you are still by my side. Now let us continue with chapter 7. The morning after the rehearsal dinner arrived with an unsettling calm. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains in the thin golden stripes, settling over the wooden table where I placed the gown the night before. My body felt heavy, but not with the familiar weight of fear or regret. It was a different heaviness, the kind that follows after setting down something long carried. I wrapped my hands around a warm cup of tea and listened to the quiet hum of the house. For years that quiet had irritated me, reminding me that Heather rarely called or visited, but today it felt like a space where I could finally breathe. By mid-morning, messages began arriving. A neighbor sent a vague note asking if I was all right. An old coworker wrote to say she had heard something happened at the Ellington event. People loved a story, especially one involving humiliation wrapped in sequins and flowers. I knew how these things traveled through Charleston, drifting from porch to porch like loose leaves in the wind. Some praised me for standing up for myself. Some hinted that I had gone too far. I read every message without answering, letting each one pass through me like water slipping around stone. Heather did not call. I had expected that. She was likely surrounded by chaos, forced to explain a truth she had never intended anyone to hear. I imagined her future in-laws questioning her respect, questioning her character. I did not take pleasure in that thought, but I could not protect her from the consequences of her own choices. The truth had simply stepped into the light, and once it did, it could not be tucked away again. As the afternoon stretched on, the ache inside me shifted. I began to wonder if I had been too firm with her outside that hotel. The memory of her small voice, the tremble when she said "Mom," returned again and again. I thought of the child she once was, the girl who used to curl up against my side after school, and for a moment, uncertainty crept in. But I reminded myself that love without boundaries becomes a slow self-erasure, and I had already erased enough of myself for her. Near dusk, a postal truck rumbled to a stop outside. The mailman handed me a padded envelope with my name written in a careful script. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from an estate lawyer who had contacted me weeks ago. My heart hesitated. Something inside told me this envelope carried more than paper. I placed it on the counter without opening it, the way one sets aside a delicate fabric until the mind is steady enough to handle it. Just as the sky turned violet, a soft knock sounded on the front door. When I opened it, Heather stood on the porch, her shoulders drawn inward, her eyes swollen and ringed with fatigue. She looked like she had aged overnight. For a moment, she did not step in. She simply stood there, holding her bag, as if it were a shield she no longer believed in. Inside the kitchen, she sat across from me in silence. The air felt fragile. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small object, placing it on the table. It was my oldest sewing gauge, the one I thought I had lost years ago. Her voice was barely audible. "This belongs to you." It was not an apology, but it was something real, something humble, something new. She lowered her head and began to cry without sound. I did not reach across the table, but I did not move away either. We stayed like that as the room dimmed around us, two women stitched together by pain, love, and the possibility of beginning again. On the table beside us, the unopened envelope waited patiently, holding truths of its own. The following morning settled into the house with an unfamiliar gentleness. Heather had slept in the spare room, and although we exchanged only brief greetings over breakfast, the air between us felt less sharp than the night before. She moved quietly around the kitchen, rinsing dishes with a care that almost seemed like reverence, while I sat at the table with the unopened envelope from the estate lawyer resting in front of me. It had waited through the night, heavy with whatever truth it carried, and I knew I could not postpone it any longer. When Heather stepped out onto the porch to call her work, I reached for my scissors and cut the seal. A thin stack of paper slid out, along with a letter written in my late husband's unmistakable handwriting. The sight of it struck me harder than I had expected. His words were steady, deliberate, and filled with a quiet sorrow I had never fully understood while he was alive. He wrote about the years we had struggled, the pride that had kept him from sharing his fears, and the mistakes he had buried in silence. He spoke of a past intertwining with the Ellington family, a past marked by humiliation, misunderstanding, and regret. He wrote, "If this truth reaches you, choose honesty over silence. Choose yourself." Tucked behind the letter was a small ledger documenting a savings account he had built quietly over time, along with a note about a journal he had filled for us. My hands shook as I read. He had been trying, in his own broken way, to leave us with dignity he had never felt he possessed. I pressed the letter to my chest, letting the grief and gratitude spread slowly through me. Heather returned to the doorway and froze when she saw my tears. She stepped closer, but did not speak, as if afraid one wrong word would shatter the fragile peace forming between us. I told her about the letter, about the struggle her father had hidden, and about the weight of the past that had never fully left me. She listened silently, her face crumpling with growing understanding. I could see the moment she recognized how deeply she had repeated patterns neither of us deserved. A knock interrupted us. When I opened the door, Amara Ellington stood outside, her elegant posture softened by an expression I had never seen on her face. Heather stiffened, expecting confrontation, but Amara lifted a hand gently. She asked to speak with me alone. In the living room, Amara confessed pieces of her own past, the pressure of her upbringing, the cruelty she had allowed, and the shame that had followed her into adulthood. She spoke of my husband with a sorrow that felt sincere. Then she surprised me. She offered to help me open a sewing studio, not as charity, but as an act of repair for the harm that had been allowed to grow between our families. I hesitated, but as I looked at her and then at Heather, I felt something shift. Healing, I realized, required participation from all sides. I agreed on one condition. The studio would carry my mother's name, Grace Weaver Studio. As the sun lowered outside, the three of us stood together in the kitchen, bound by past wounds, but finally, for the first time, moving toward something better. If you are still watching, and you can feel the ending approaching, please comment number 8 below to show you are here until the very end. Now let us move forward to the final chapters. 1 month later, the streets of Savannah carried the soft warmth of early spring as I turned the key in the new glass door of Grace Weaver Studio. Sunlight spilled across the polished wooden floor, illuminating bolts of fabric stacked neatly against the walls. The sign above the entrance shone proudly, Grace Weaver Studio. Every stitch holds a story. Standing in the doorway, I felt a quiet tremor rise in my chest. I had imagined this moment many times, yet nothing compared to seeing it alive, breathing, and entirely mine. Heather arrived just minutes later, her hair tied back, her expression earnest. She had been helping me prepare the space since the first can of paint touched the walls. Watching her move carefully between tables, arranging spools of thread and straightening sewing tools, I saw a humility in her that had never existed before. She pricked her finger at least twice that morning, wincing softly, then laughing in embarrassment. It was in these small moments that I sensed true change. Not the desperate change born from guilt, but the patient, steady kind that grows only after a heart learns where it went wrong. Soon the door opened again, then again, as women from the neighborhood stepped inside. Some were young mothers, some were widows, some were simply lost in their own stories. They came with scraps of fabric and hesitant smiles, unsure what to expect. I welcomed each of them, guiding them toward the workstations we had prepared. The room filled with the soft rhythm of sewing machines and the murmur of women rediscovering the strength they had misplaced somewhere along the years. In the afternoon, Amara Ellington walked in, dressed simply for the first time since I had known her. She carried a bouquet of lilies and a humility that softened the sharpness she once wore like armor. She congratulated us, speaking gently, never once assuming authority. A few women recognized her and whispered, surprised to see her standing beside me as an equal rather than above me as society once dictated. I accepted the flowers with a nod, grateful for the bridge she was trying to build. While dusting a shelf, Heather discovered the leather journal her father had left for us. She opened it and began reading quietly. A few pages in, she froze. Tears welled in her eyes. She handed me the journal, unable to speak. On the page, in her father's uneven handwriting, were the words that broke and mended something inside both of us. If our daughter ever forgets her mother, I hope life will guide her back to her. Heather sat beside me. She placed her hand on mine and whispered, I am learning, Mom. It was only 3 words, but they carried more honesty than any apology she could have offered. The day ended with the studio glowing in warm light. I locked the front door and stepped outside. The sky had settled into a deep pink. As I looked back through the glass, I understood something simple and true. Lives, like fabric, can always be re-sewn when the heart is finally willing. Years passed gently, like fabric sliding beneath a practiced hand. Grace Weaver Studio settled into its own rhythm, a rhythm made of humming machines, soft conversations, and the warm sunlight that filtered through the tall windows each morning. My hair grew fully silver, my hands lined with the fine marks of time, Yet my spirit felt lighter than it had in decades. The studio had become more than a workspace. It had become a sanctuary where women rediscovered pieces of themselves they thought were lost forever. Women from all walks of life filled the tables each week. Some came after difficult divorces. Some came after the loss of husbands or jobs. Others arrived simply because life had worn them thin, and they needed a quiet place to remember their own worth. I taught them how to guide a needle, how to mend a seam, and how to breathe through frustration. In return, they taught me how universal resilience is, how every woman carries a story stitched with both pain and perseverance. Heather grew into her role beside me with a grace I had once feared she might never possess. She taught children on Saturdays, leaning gently over their small hands, guiding them through the first clumsy attempts at threading a needle. The children adored her. The women admired her. I watched her move through the studio with the ease of someone who had finally learned how to stand in her own truth. Our bond had deepened into something steadier, something grounded in respect rather than expectation. Nia, my granddaughter, became the youngest presence in the studio. She darted between tables with a ribbon in her hair and a spool of thread in her pocket. Sometimes she tangled the fabric or dropped pins in places we would discover days later, but she brought a joy that reminded me of everything I once fought to protect. On quiet evenings, after the machine stopped and the last student left, I often sat alone and looked at the framed red thread hanging on the wall. It glowed softly in the dimming light. That thread had survived years of hardship just as I had. It reminded me that every tear, every betrayal, every moment of humiliation had carved a path toward strength I never knew I possessed. I thought often of the night in the ballroom, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Without that painful moment, none of this healing would exist. That night was the beginning of the woman I had finally become. As Heather locked the doors and Nia wrapped the red thread around her wrist, I stepped outside and felt the warmth of the setting sun. Every wound I had carried had become a stitch in the life I now lived. And I knew with absolute clarity that when a heart tears, the answer is not to hide it. The answer is to thread the needle and begin again. Life has a way of unraveling us and stitching us back together in patterns we never expected. Every heartbreak, every moment of doubt, every silence that felt too heavy to bear becomes part of a larger tapestry that reveals its meaning only with time. Healing is not the absence of scars, but the courage to turn them into something strong enough to carry us forward. Dignity is not granted by others, but shaped quietly within, strengthened by each choice to rise instead of collapse. And love, when it is honest, teaches us not only how to hold on, but how to let go and rebuild with intention. Thank you for sharing this journey. If the story spoke to you, feel free to leave a comment, share your thoughts, and follow the channel for more life stories woven with heart and hope.